Bonjour class, today we're learning a new verb tense called le futur simple, and it is actually pretty easy or simple as the name implies. And here are a few of the things that we're going to learn about today. The first one, we're going to learn what the difference is between le futur proche, the way that we've already learned to talk about things in the future, and le futur simple, the new way that we're learning today. We're going to learn how to conjugate le futur simple. Then lastly, how to talk about the future in French, because it's a little bit counterintuitive. So let's start with qu'est-ce que c'est la différence entre le futur simple et le futur proche? Le futur proche, that's the way that we've already learned. That's talking about the near future. That's the one that has the subject, and then aller conjugated, and then the infinitive. So for example, the sentence je vais étudier would be le futur proche, because we have our subject here, je, we have aller conjugated, which is vais, and we have our infinitive étudier. This is the infinitive because we still have the er ending at the end of the verb. And that one means I am going to study, so that fits in with how le futur proche talks about what you are going to do. Going, we can remember, that's part of the definition for le futur proche because we use aller, which means to go, to form the futur proche. So for example, like we said, je vais étudier literally means I am going to study. This use of the future is a little bit less formal, a little bit more informal, so we'd usually see it more in speech or conversation, and it's more immediate. It's something that you are going to do right away. So you would use this if you're saying I am going to study, if you're talking about something that you're going to do right then. On the other hand, we have le futur simple, our new way to talk about the future. This talks about what you will do. For example, I will study, as opposed to I am going to study. This one is more formal, so this is the one that we will more commonly use in writing. And it's not as immediate. So for example, you would say I'm going to study if you're, leaving right away for the library, but you'd say I will study if you mean like I will study this weekend or I will study more this semester. That would be le futur simple. It's really important to remember today. We'll talk about this more in other slides in this tutorial, but just start remembering. Just like when we learned le conditionnel, we said that there was no word for would, like I would study. Same thing with le futur simple. There is no word that you just replace to say I will study. So with that in mind, let's talk about how to conjugate le futur simple. The steps for the futur simple are very, very similar to the steps for the conditional. We start with the infinitive or irregular stem of your verb. These are the same irregular stems as the conditional. Okay, so when I promised that you had to remember those because it would be important, I wasn't lying. Here's where they come up again. Then we add the future endings to the end of the infinitive or irregular stem. For the simple future, the endings that you add are very similar to the conjugation of the irregular verb avoir. So if you're conjugating something in the simple future for je, you add ai at the end of the infinitive or irregular stem. For tu, you add as. For il, elle, or on, you add a. For nous, you add ons. This is the one that looks a little bit different than the conjugation of avoir. Just imagine getting rid of the av at the beginning. For vous, you add ez. And for il or elle, you add ont. So you add each of these endings based on the subject to either the infinitive or the irregular stem. So let's work through some examples together. So in your notes, we're going to practice how we would conjugate étudier to study in the futur simple. So for example, I will study, you will study, she will study, we will study, you all will study, or they will study. So go ahead and write these English sentences in your notes. Pause here and go back and try to see how you would write these or translate these in French using the simple future. So go ahead and pause here, and then once you have your answers, hit play again. So we have our answers here. It would be j'étudierai, because we have our infinitive, and then we add the ending ai. Tu étudieras, again we have our infinitive, and then we have the ending as in this case. Elle étudiera, same pronunciation, but the ending is just the A. Nous étudierons, ONS. Vous étudierez, easy, and ils étudieront, ONT. So you can see just glancing at these, just like the conditional, it's only one word. We do not put a word for will in front of study. We change something at the end of the verb instead. And it's super important to get these endings together because if you put the wrong ending, it can be very easily confused with the conditional. So we want to keep these endings in mind. Also, just a reminder of our irregular stems. The irregular stems, like I mentioned earlier, are the same as the ones that we learned for the conditional, but we could probably all use a refresher. So for aller, the stem is ir, so it would be j'irai. For apercevoir, which means to perceive or to catch sight of, it would be apercevoir. Avoir, to have, becomes aur. Devoir, to have to, becomes devre. Envoyer, to send, becomes envers. Être, to be, becomes ser. Faire, to do or to make, becomes faire. Pouvoir, to be able to, becomes pour. Recevoir, to receive, becomes recevoir. Savoir, to know, becomes savoir. Venir, to come, becomes viendre. Et finalement, vouloir, to want, becomes voudre. So here you see the infinitive, the stem, and then an example of the future. So any of these that you don't remember well from the conditional, go ahead and jot these down right now. And lastly, if you're talking about the future in French, it's important to remember this distinction between two terms. When we say le futur, that's when we're talking about the future referring specifically to the grammatical verb tense. So for example, you would say en classe, nous étudions le futur. So in class, we're studying the future tense. But you want to use l'avenir if you're talking about things that will actually happen in the future. Le futur, that phrase is really just for grammar. L'avenir, that's the one that you want to use if you're actually talking about stuff that has not happened yet. So for example, dans l'avenir, vous irez, so our example of le futur simple, aux universités. In the future, you all will go to college. So it's important to keep that distinction between le futur et l'avenir in mind. Et ça, c'est la fin. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat simple lesson compared to some other topics. Remember to write down the endings and the irregular stems because that will help us a lot in class.